Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today we are going to talk on one of the another interesting and important topics in the subject called philosophy. Our topic of discussion is on Shabd Pramana in classical Indian philosophy, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Verma's immense experience as well as his area in the expertise would definitely help us out in understanding today's topic in detail. So I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Ajay Verma and would request him to give us in-depth knowledge on the topic. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Hello viewers. So the topic of discussion today is Shabda as Pramana in classical Indian philosophy. And before we go in detail about the topic of discussion today, we would remember that we had briefly discussed about the notion of Pramana in classical Indian philosophy in one of our earlier lectures. So before we start talking about Shabda as a Pramana, in classical Indian philosophy, it'll be good for us to have a quick kind of recapitulation of the idea or the notion of Pramana in Indian philosophy as such. So we would be able to recall that the word Pramana in Indian philosophy, in classical Indian philosophy, basically means a valid means of knowledge. And a corresponding term for knowledge in classical Indian philosophy is Prama. Now, what does Prama mean? Generally, we talk about true knowledge, right knowledge. We find such words being used in some of the books as well. But from the point of view of philosophy, it's not strictly speaking a correct usage of the term. Because when we talk about knowledge, the idea of truth, is somehow already ingrained in knowledge. So you claim to know something when you also know that what you know is true. So otherwise, you are in a certain way not rightly talking about that particular piece of cognition. So, there are two different words. One is cognition and the other is knowledge. So, first of all, whenever we attempt to know something, the process begins with cognition of an object. And cognition is a bare, so to speak, registering of the object, or a simple kind of a reception of some kind of a sense data. Some kind of a reception of sense data with us. So this is what happens in a kind of cognition. We receive sense data, we conceptualize it in a certain way, and then we claim to cognize an object. We claim to have seen that object. We claim to have, but at the same time, cognition, after sort of we conceptualize an object as this or that, could be true or false. So the idea here, the point to sort of to take home here is that that cognition and knowledge are two different terms, and they are used in different senses in philosophy. Here, Pramana would be a means of knowledge, and it's not that all knowledge is it's not that all cognitions are true, but very often we use the term knowledge synonymously with cognition, whereas knowledge is a slightly higher order term and differs from the word cognition, because cognition, depending upon the fact, depending upon the factual situation, cognitions could be true or false. But knowledge, we claim to have knowledge, when we have certified that, when we have seen to it that, when we have, taken the factual situation into consideration and have tried to match it up with our cognition, and when we know that, there is a kind of a match between the two, then we can actually claim to know. So we know that in Western analytic tradition, knowledge is defined as justified true belief. So it's not only a belief, but it is a belief for which we have certain kind of justification to hold, and also at the same time it's a belief which we know to be true. So in that sense, cognition and knowledge are two different kind of sort of concepts which capture a very different sense. So in classical Indian philosophy, right cognition is termed as Brahma. And a part of justification that a piece of knowledge gets is also, apart from other things, also through what means we have arrived at that knowledge. So very broadly defined, this is how we could talk about the very idea of Pramana in classical Indian philosophy. So there are a range of pramanas that have been proposed. The highest number of pramanas are held by Mimamsakas, which includes perception or pratyaksha, anumana or inference, upamana or comparison, shabda or word or verbal authority, as also is often called, anupalabdhi, also arthapatti, among others. So there's a range of pramanas that are available in classical Indian philosophy, and today we are going to talk about one of the very important pramanas. In some ways, is central to the entire pramana system. Which is Shabda. Now, where does the importance of Shabda as a pramana lie? As we should be able to recall, in as far as classical Indian philosophy is concerned, there are 9 schools of thought. There are 9 schools of thought, among them 6 traditions, 6 systems of thought, which are also called Shaddarshanas. They come under the category of orthodox systems. And then there are the 3 systems, which includes Jainism, Buddhism, and Charvakas. They are called heterodox system. And among Shaddarshanas, among orthodox systems, are Purv Mimamsa and Uttar Mimamsa. Uttar Mimamsa is also called Vedanta, Sankhya Yoga, and Nyaya and Visheshik school. Now, accepting among orthodox schools, accepting Vaisheshikas, Shabda is acceptable to all the remaining schools as far as Orthodox traditions are concerned. And the Buddhists are completely opposed to it, and if at all they want to include it under inference. Charvakas, as we are already aware, don't admit of any pramana other than pratyaksh. But what's the importance of Shabda as Pramana? As we would be able to recall, this division between Orthodox and heterodox school is based upon their belief in the Vedic authority, in the scriptural authority of the Vedas. So so these schools are divided between orthodox and heterodox traditions based upon their acceptance or non-acceptance of scriptural authority of the Vedas. So all the schools of all the orthodox schools among classical Indian schools of philosophy accept the scriptural authority of the Vedas, whereas heterodox schools completely deny that. Now, having said that, and so this is one of the reasons why Shabda as a pramana is very, very important, has a distinction of a certain kind among different pramanas that are proposed in classical Indian philosophy. Now, having said that, now we should take into consideration what are the concerns that stem forth from there. And now, before we start talking about that, we must understand that when we are talking about sort of verbal authority or scriptural authority of certain texts, what are the presumptions that we sort of come into the picture? So whenever we are talking about verbal authority or scriptural authority, what we mean is that we already believe that whatever is written in a scripture is true by in virtue of the fact that it's there as a part of the text. So the point to understand here is that whenever we are talking about scriptural authority, the idea is that a particular text has has authority of its own. Whatever is written there is in a certain way sacrosanct, and that that sacrosanct character gives it certain kind of immunity to like inquiries of inquiries regarding the truth that we generally otherwise so they don't lend themselves as susceptible. So, because of the scriptural authority and the sacrosanct character of certain texts, we don't want to examine the subject matter of a particular set of texts. Now, regarding that, there's this debate about when how to examine whether a particular piece of cognition is right or not, and there are different takes on the issue. We have sort of very briefly probably talked about it in our sort of earlier lectures, but to sort of recapitulate it very quickly. We would remember that the idea here is that according to some schools, which includes among others Nyaya school, it's believed that when we have a particular piece of cognition, it stands in need for further examination in terms of its truth content. And how do we go about examining it? One of the ways of examining it would be that when we make a statement, very often we describe certain state of affairs. So statements like there is a pool of water lying over there. What we are saying is we are trying to state a fact. We are trying to make it known to the hearer. And how do we examine whether what we see actually when we claim to perceive something? How do we examine whether it's true or not? It's pretty commonsensical that sort of best way of going about would be that we go to the location and we sort of examine it for ourselves. We examine whether the object in question sort of acts in characteristic ways, and once we have got an idea about that, then we can call our statement, sort of our cognition could be known to be true or false, and so this is sort of any cognition which results in unfrustrated activity on this account would be held to be true, and this test of some instance of knowledge to result in unfrustrated activity is called artha kriyakaritva. Now, as opposed to this, there is another another take on the issue, which is put forward by Prabhakaras, that is Prabhakara school of Mimamsas. So now Prabhakara Mimamsakas point out that any piece of knowledge comes along with its own validity. So as far as the validity or the truth of a particular piece of cognition is concerned, its pramanyata, the proof does not need to come through any extrinsic means, anything extraneous to the knowing situation itself. They say that in any case, whenever we are talking about, whenever we suggest certain criteria to prove the validity of a particular piece of cognition, we are just taking it a step further. But we cannot conclusively say anything about the validity, because that validity criterion in turn would be in need for certain further validity. So one example would be that it's not that all true cognitions result in unfrustrated activity, because the question of activity is in a certain way different from the question of the truth of the situation. So it might happen that we see some water far away, but or maybe far away in a desert, but it's not true cognition. As a matter of fact, it's just an appearance of water because of mirage. It's not actual water. But when we reach the place, it might so happen that by chance there is some water. There is actually a pool of water there, which was, but what was visible to us when we were perceiving that particular location from distance was not the actual water, but the appearance of water created by mirage. So now such cognitions might result in unfrustrated activity. But we know that a person outside of the situation would know that what was initially cognized was not the actual water, but only an appearance of water. So this is one objection amongst others. So now the idea here is that Prabhakara Mimamsakas try to preserve sort of tries to preserve the sanctity of Shabda as a pramana by proposing, because for Mimamsakas, the central pramana for them is Shabda. So they are mainly there could be a difference of opinion in this, but they are mainly a school of philology where where sort of they want to basically focus their study on Vedas, on Vedic literature. And the first sutra of Mimamsa Sutra is Athatu Dharma Jigyasa, which means less therefore inquire into the nature of dharma. So the idea there is to understand the notion of dharma, then to understand to have the right idea about what's the right thing to do for us. And according to them, the answer to that is only to be found, the only source to find that answer is the Vedic literature, which sort of instills a sense of dharma in us, which instills sort of a bhavana in us. which instills a sense of duty in us and propels us to do only the right actions. So in this way, their central concern is the knowledge of dharma, which is intimately connected with the Vedic corpus, and this is why their focus is mainly on the Vedas, and from that point of view, Shabda is central pramana for them. So this was this is why Shabda as a pramana is very important for the study of Indian philosophy as such, and the point here is also that this is also the main criteria on the basis of which we make this distinction between orthodox schools and heterodox schools. And also, we must understand that one of the criteria of justification and truth is a little bit different in when it comes to classical Indian philosophy, and from that point of view, we must understand the meaning of prama and pramana. Which is generally defined as pramana is generally translated as rather a means of knowledge, valid means of knowledge. So in certain pramanas like Shabda, because of the sacrosanct nature of the source of knowledge, we believe that whatever suggestions are there in the Vedic literature come along with their own truth value. So they are swata pramanya, to borrow the term from Prabhakar Mimamsakas. They are self-validated. We don't need to look for their validation extrinsically. So they get their validity. They get their truth value. In virtue of belonging to, in virtue of having Vedas as their very source. So now, having understood this, we could take our discussion a step further. Now, there are some other set of questions that immediately arise when we talk about Shabda as a means of knowledge. There are different set of questions like do words if the main point of reading Vedic literature is to understand the nature of dharma, then there are descriptive sentences as well in the Vedic literature. So now when we read some of these descriptive sentences, are they capable of suggesting anything to us? The point here is that when we are speaking or when we are reading any text, it's a commonsensical matter that there are different kinds of sentences that we find there. There are descriptive sentences. There are prescriptive sentences. There are imperative sentences. There are commands. So there, the main distinction is between descriptive sentences and prescriptive sentences. Now, among prescriptive sentences, so to speak, this sense of getting to know our dharma is clear. I mean, we can clearly understand that. If a sentence is of the nature of command, then of course it's very clear that we are being suggested to do something, which means what is being suggested is that this is the right thing to do. So if there are prescriptive sentences, vidhivakyas in the Vedas, then it's very clear, what it means is that this is the right thing to do. But also, but there are not just prescriptive sentences in the Vedic literature. There are also descriptive sentences, especially Upanishads, which are supposed to be the tail portion of the Vedas. There are mainly descriptive sentences, and among them the most important of them are sentences called Mahavakyas. among which are Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, so which don't seem to suggest us to do anything. They seem to be more of the nature of descriptions. So since in the Vedas, in Vedas too, even if for that matter, even if we exclude for the time being Upanishadic corpus. And in Vedas also there are several descriptive sentences. Now they don't seem to give us any suggestion. They don't seem to be of the nature of commands. They don't seem to be they don't seem to be of the nature of exhortations, trying to sort of instill any bhavana in us. Now, according to Mimamsakas, especially Prabhakar Mimamsakas, that is, they say that the main element in any sentence. First of all, we must understand that to understand what's the right thing to do, whenever there is a suggestion in a sentence towards that, it requires at least a sentence. It cannot be done by one single word alone. So, according to them, first of all, irrespective of whether a sentence appears to be descriptive or prescriptive, irrespective of of the syntactical structure, so to speak, or for that matter, sort of the nature of the sentence, whether it's of the nature of command or simple description, they say that all sentences should be read as if they were suggestive of doing certain kind of action. So one of the commonsensical example here would be one of the examples that is offered by one of the best known scholars of Indian philosophy, B.K. Matilal. He gives the example of a sentence. So suppose a friend of us says that there is a snake in the grass out there. Now, it looks like a simple description of things, but we know that apart from a mere description, what the other person is saying is that you rather be careful while approaching that location. So maybe suggestion is that maybe carry a stick, or if it's not necessary to go towards that direction. If it's not necessary to go towards that direction, then don't move into that direction at all. So sentences which on the surface appear like mere descriptions, depending upon what is meant, what has been intended, may turn out to be what is the overall import of the sentence. We can understand that sort of they are not mere descriptions, but the apparently descriptive sentences could also be suggestive of certain actions. So friends, we'll take our discussion forward from here. We'll take a very small break here, and we'll return after a few moments. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving this productive session, friends. We will be back after a short break, so you're requested to be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Shabda as Pramana in classical Indian philosophy, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is an eminent professor of philosophy, and through the live sessions of CC he always gives his best. So let's take advantages from his experiences once again, and let's welcome our guest Dr. Ajay Verma. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Welcome back here. So we were talking about the distinction, the difference between descriptive sentences and prescriptive sentences that we make, but how according to Mimamsakas, since Vedas are only a set of certain sentences which are suggestive of doing the right thing. And since their focus of inquiry is to understand the nature of dharma, therefore, according to them, even the so-called descriptive sentences are to be interpreted as if they were suggestive of doing something, and doing something which would be the virtuous thing, which would be the right thing to do. So this is how Prabhakara, in a certain way, conflate the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive sentences in favor of prescriptive sentences. So this is one, and there are a lot of their views about Shabda as a pramana stem from are an offshoot of with this overall presumption that they work with. And another thing that we must understand here before we proceed further is that as far as classical Indian philosophy is concerned, Shabda, which is often translated as a word, is generally sort of many times is understood as a linguistic unit, like a word as a linguistic unit. As a group of letters, as a meaningful group of letters, but in Sanskrit, it has a larger connotation because there's a separate word in Sanskrit, to suggest word as a unit of phonemes, which is pada. So what we generally understand by word, also this sort of confusion also arises from the fact that in Hindi this word has been borrowed from Sanskrit, and in Hindi the word Shabda is used in the sense of word as a grammatical unit. Word, as a group of letters, whereas in Indian philosophy, from the point of view of philosophy, Shabda means a source of knowledge, language as such, anything to do with language. I mean, there's all this entire gamut together is referred to as Shabda. So now, having understood that, let's try and understand what are the different set of problems that are taken into consideration and that are debated further on. One of the basic issues that is discussed and comes to the fore right in the beginning when we talk about word and its meaning is what is it that a word refers to, and regarding that there are different there's a difference of opinion among different schools. So say for example for Mimamsakas, and for that matter grammarians also by and large, words are words only refer to universals, not the particulars. So when we talk about, say for example, cow, this is the classical example that we find being used again and again in Indian philosophical literature. So, what it refers to, the word cow refers to, or the word go, refers to mainly the cowness, the generic term. So it says it refers to the universal cowness, and they would rather believe, they would rather want to believe that it doesn't refer to particular at all. But then the problem arises that when we use the word cow in a sentence like tie this cow, or bring this cow here, we're not talking about a universal cowhood to be brought here. We are talking about a particular cow to be brought to a particular place. So for them, like when we sort of when we entertain such idea that word refers to mainly universal alone, and it doesn't refer to the particular, such problems are bound to occur. Therefore, Naiyayikas believe that word not only refers to the universal, but rather it refers to a particular as characterized by a particular universal. So the point here is that it refers to both. It refers to a particular cow, because when we use it in our general, when we use language in our day-to-day communication, we use words in sentences, and when we use words, we generally refer to particular situations, particular facts around us, and even in imperative sentences. In injunctive sentences like bring the cow here, we only refer to particular objects, not generalities. Therefore, for them, when we use in the word cow in a sentence like bring the cow here, we are referring to a particular cow, but we know it to be a cow because this universal is also available to us at the same time. So as we have sort of in some of our previous lectures, we have briefly discussed Nayayika's point of view. Now to sort of recapitulate it quickly, we know that for Nayayikas, language is, so to speak, the mirror of reality. So there is some kind of structure that is inherent in everything around us. So there is a certain scheme under which sort of we find things, we see things, and that structure, which is in Sanskrit called Nam Jati Adi Yojana. So names, generalities, and as kind of a schematic structure that we find the relationships that that things bear to each other, like Sanyog and Samavaya. Samavaya is this relationship of inherence, when something inheres in the other, such that if the two objects are taken apart, both of them differ in nature. Whereas Sanyog is a kind of relationship where the individuality of the objects concerned is preserved, such that even if the two objects are sort of taken out from from that relationship, they have their individuality, their individual nature still intact. So the point here is that according to Nayayikas, things there is sort of some kind of schematic unity around us, and that is reflected since we cognize it and we express it. And for expression of it, we require language. Therefore, the same kind of schematic unity is reflected in our judgments as well. So therefore, there is, like, so to speak, one-to-one correspondence, between the abhideyatva or nameability of things, the linguistic aspect of things, and the objects, the real objects which exist out there in their own right. So for them, since an object is both a Vishesh and Samanya at the same time. So, we know a chair to be chair because it has chairness in it. Otherwise, we wouldn't know it as, an object, such as such and such kind of an object. So since we know it as such and such kind of an object, we know it as we know it as like a well-defined object, because universal is already inherent in it and is given to us in perception. So we perceive the universal aspect of the universal inherent in the object, but at the same time the object is also Vishesha. It is a particular object. So they try to strike a balance between this between the universality of an object on the one hand, without which an object wouldn't make much sense to us. And also at the same time, they don't see any contradiction involved, when they say that an object is particular and universal at the same time. So what is meant here is that an object is a particular as defined, as delimited by the universal inherent in it, and the universal which lends itself to perception by us. So, in a very similar way, since language is a mirror of reality, according to them, word, what is referred to by word, is particular as qualified, as characterized by a universal. Grammarians, would also, so for them, there are no particulars. Like they also do not believe in what is called nirvikalpa perception. So it's often believed. Bhatmimansakas and Naiyayikas are unanimous about this, that before we form a judgment, before when we perceive something, when we see something, we form a judgment in our mind. So, say for example, if we see sort of a ground over there, what happens is that we receive some sense data, and based on that, we form a judgment. That there is a ground over there. So there is a verbal aspect to it, but also at the same time they believe that there is a stage of perception where we have not conceptualized, so to speak, the sense data that we had received. So there is, so to speak, a pre-verbal stage of perception, even if it were theoretical. So where our perception hasn't been infused into words, so hasn't been sort of coded, so to speak, in words. So they admit of a stage of perception, of that kind. Whereas for a grammarian, all cognition is verbal cognition. Apart from verbal sort of cognition, what other kind of cognition could there be? We have when we have no justified way of talking about that. So, like as many of us would know. There's philosophers who would say that limits of my language are the limits of my world. Among others, famously, this is ascribed famously to Wittgenstein as well. So what we mean here is that if there is a reality beyond language, we have no means of knowing it, because all knowledge, is gained to us, is gained by us, comes to us only through language, as is already verbalized by the time we claim it. By the time it belongs to us. So whatever sort of knowledge we have is verbalized knowledge, is already verbalized, and therefore apart from the verbalization of it, what kind of knowledge there could be, we don't really know. Kant tries to make a suggestion of a similar kind in another way. He seems to suggest that we have certain categories of mind which are involved, which are transcendently involved when we try to make a judgment. But there's a part of the object which doesn't lend itself to those categories, which remains as a residue lying within the object. Because it's beyond the categories of thought that we have. So that particular aspect of the object, that kind of residue that still remains there, is called the thing in itself, also called as noumena. But then, it's pointed out by Hegel that it's to believe that there is something about things that escapes, the categories is contradictory in terms, because if there is something over and above the categories of mind, which which is all that we have, through which we form a judgment, is to posit something over and above that. Beyond that is a contradiction in terms, because then we have no means of knowing it at all, even knowing it that it exists. So in that sense, it's a contradiction in terms. It's like there being a complete darkness before you, and somebody saying with surety, well, in that darkness there is something, I don't know what. Maybe darkness is darkness in absolute terms. You cannot suggest anything about that at all. So you cannot be aware of anything existing, for that matter, out there. So the point here is that if our categories are non-operative at all, altogether, towards a certain aspect, a certain part of the object, which is called thing in itself, then we wouldn't even know it to be existing. Conversely, when we posit that there is a part of the object which doesn't lend itself to categories of thought, then we are already, in that very act of, suggesting something like this, we have already projected one category, of thought, namely that of existence. So, we already posit existence as we have already posited that something to be at least existing. So this is how it's a kind of contradiction in terms. So now to bring the point home, we were discussing all this in the context of whether there could be pre-verbal stage of knowledge or judgment, and grammarians categorically say no to it. So according to them, all knowledge that we have has to come in the form of language, has to be worded. So in that sense, grammarians, famously amongst them Bhartrhari, suggests that the world as we cognize it and language are two aspects of the same reality. They stem forth from the same ultimate transcendental reality, which is of the nature of Brahman, and he calls it as Shabda Brahman, because this ultimate reality is of the nature of Shabda. So, from that reality, so to speak, on the one hand, we have this entire world sort of stemming forth, and on the other, parallelly, we have a language, sort of making its manifestation. So, both the world and the word, so to speak, are intertwined into each other. So if we don't have a word, then in a certain way the world doesn't exist for us. So it also sort of this also lends itself to some of like the more sort of recent scientific explanations about how we cognize. We know that it's around the same time that we learn language that we start having a sense of I as an individual existing there in the world. So there have been some experiments, among them famous mirror experiment, where we bring a child close to a mirror and we try to see whether the child realizes that it's his or her own image in reflected in the mirror. So we realize that below a particular age, children don't realize that it's them being reflected in the mirror. It's after a particular age that they start realizing that it's me. So, but also, from the point of view of language, what is more important for us to understand is that it's only around the time when children start having a sense of language. Also, it's around that time when they start having the sense of I, when they start recognizing themselves in the mirror. They know themselves as existing as a separate individuated entity in the world, within the world. Also, very importantly, it's around the same time that children also start forming memories. So, the point here is that grammarians probably, their suggestion, they are probably right when they suggest that, all cognition, I mean, we would start forming judgments only when we are equipped with language, when we have, certain kind of linguisticality. The term for that is shabdana. Bhartrhari uses the term shabdana in his magnum opus Vakyapadya. So when we hear, it's only sort of through our linguisticality that things make any sense to us at all. So if we don't have language, probably like in very initial years, a child probably has some kind of a pre-verbal stage of mind, but then at that stage we are hardly registering anything. We don't form memories. We are completely driven by certain other kind of drives. We are merely looking for food, and that's probably our only drive. So the point here is that for grammarians, the word and the world are not two distinct entities. So the relationship between the two is that of tadatmaya, is that of identity. They are not two but one. This is why there's some kind of a non-dualism is being suggested here. So Bhartrhari is like we could probably safely say that what the kind of theory that is being suggested by Bhartrhari is some kind of Shabd Advait. Some kind of verbal non-dualism. So according to him, the word and what is being referred to by a word, they are not two distinct things. Thing has any meaning for us in the world only through the language, and outside of it, what the world is, we have no way of making sense at all. So these are three different takes on the issue. One that of that the word and what is referred to by that word, the relationship between the two is that of identity, as suggested by grammarians. The Mimamsakas, who believe that what is primarily referred to by a word is the universal, not the particular, because according to them, particulars, if universal was some kind of totality of particulars, then we know that this particularity sort of increases and decreases. We know that if a word chair sort of like denotes the collectivity of chair, and sort of this is what universal means. If this is what we believe, then we know that the total number of chairs would keep on decreasing and increasing. So they believe that universal is not a collectivity of particulars, but universal is and what words refer to is primarily the universal, not the particular. And for Naiyayikas, it's only the particular that is it's mainly the particular that is referred to, but as defined, as characterized by the universal that resides in the object. And there is a third, radical take on the issue, which comes from not the Orthodox traditions, but the heterodox traditions, namely Buddhism. Now, Buddhism has a very unique take on the issue. They believe, we are already aware. That Buddhists completely dismiss the idea of universal. So, in one of the Tibetan texts, the writer says that the people who see samanya in things are sort of people who have illusion, because they see something in things which is not there. So it's tantamount to some kind of illusion. So, according to them, there is nothing like universal at all. Any object that we see around us is only a particular, and when we start seeing it as such and such, that suchness is projected by our mind. It's a construct of our mind which is projected onto the world. So context is something that is provided by is provided to us by how we take stock of a particular situation, and that's a mental process. And this is how we make a mental construct. In terms of what a thing is, but that something through which something gets defined is not something that is a part of the givenness of the object. Seeing an object as such and such, as defined as such and such, is something that we create in our mind and then later on project onto the object, and it has nothing directly to do anything with the object at all. So therefore, it's a complete mental construct, and the word for that, given by the Naga, is kalpana. So it's something that is kalpit, that we imagine, that we construct and project onto the world. But how does it relate to the issue at hand? From this, they also conclude that word cannot bear any direct reference to any object as such, because words work in terms of generalities and things are only particulars. So there can be no direct connection available between the two. There is no direct connection between the two. Therefore, but the question in that case would remain, then how come that words seem to make sense to us? Words do make sense to us. So according to them, words make sense to us by excluding everything else apart from the thing in question. So when we use the word chair, what we mean is that that thing over there is anything non-chair. So all non-chairs are excluded, and through via negativa, in an indirect way, the word seems to make sense in terms of a particular object. So friends, we'll talk about this theory given by Dignaga. It's called Apohavad in our subsequent lecture a little more elaborately, as we will discuss Shabda as Pramana in classical Indian philosophy, and in our forthcoming lectures our main point of discussion would be a word meaning and sentential meaning, and how what kind of relationship exists between the two. So for today we will stop here. Thank you.
With this note, thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, we will be back on some other day and would be discussing on some other new topics. So keep writing us, keep watching us. We would be meeting again soon. And for writing to us, write us at info.cec@nic.in. Thank you so very much, dear friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you.